My name is Frank Kowalski, and at 68 I thought I'd seen everything life could throw at a man. 45 years working as a mechanic in this small Indiana town, raising 3 kids with my late wife Margaret, watching grandchildren grow up around my garage, I figured my biggest surprises were behind me. But life has a way of proving you wrong when you least expect it. It was Duke, my 10-year-old German Shepherd mix, who first caught the scent that would turn everything upside down. Margaret always said Duke was more than just a dog. He was my shadow, my conscience, and sometimes my guide when my stubborn pride got in the way of common sense. She'd been gone 3 years now, and Duke seemed to understand that we were all each other had left. The whole thing started at the county surplus auction last spring. I'd been going to these auctions for decades, picking up tools, spare parts, sometimes whole vehicles that the government was clearing out. It was partly business. Good parts were good parts, but mostly it was the thrill of not knowing what you'd find buried under layers of dust and bureaucracy. That particular Saturday morning was grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that keeps casual buyers home, but brings out the serious scavengers like me. Duke rode shotgun in my old Ford pickup, his nose pressed to the partially open window, cataloguing every cent the wind carried across the auction yard. The auctioneer was working through lot numbers with mechanical efficiency when they rolled out what looked like a pile of corrugated metal sheeting covered by a weathered tarp. Next up, Lot 47, surplus aircraft parts, sold as is, no warranties, no returns, he called out in his nasal drawl. Most people didn't even look up from their coffee cups. Aircraft parts could mean anything from wing nuts to engine components, and without knowing what was under that tarp, it was a gamble few were willing to take. But Duke's ears perked up, and he started that low whine he made when something didn't smell right to him. I raised my paddle more out of curiosity than conviction, figuring $25 wouldn't break me, even if it turned out to be worthless. When the hammer fell at $37.50, I wondered what I'd gotten myself into. The auction workers seemed eager to get the lot moved, almost pushing it toward my truck with a forklift before I'd even finished the paperwork. "You'll need a trailer for this one," the yard supervisor said, avoiding eye contact. "Thing's heavier than it looks." There was something in his voice, a hastiness that made Duke growl softly from the truck cab. Loading the mystery lot took 2 hours and 3 men with a crane. Whatever was under that tarp had serious weight and dimension, and the metalwork I could glimpse looked more sophisticated than simple scrap. The supervisor kept checking his watch and muttering about closing time, even though we had hours of daylight left. When I asked about paperwork or documentation, he handed me a manila envelope sealed with red tape and said, "Everything's in there, Mr. Kowalski. Government paperwork, you know how it is." Duke watched every move from the truck, his golden eyes tracking each person who got near our new acquisition. Back at the garage, I cleared out the biggest bay and spent the better part of an hour carefully removing that tarp. What emerged from underneath took my breath away. It wasn't just aircraft parts, it was a complete fighter jet engine, still in its shipping cradle, with serial numbers and military markings clearly visible. The nameplate read Pratt & Whitney J57, and even my limited knowledge of military hardware told me this was serious equipment. Duke circled the engine cautiously, his hackles slightly raised, breathing deeply through his nose as if trying to decode some invisible message. The manila envelope contained a stack of documents that made my head spin. Bills of lading, transfer orders, inventory sheets, all stamped with official seals and signatures I couldn't identify. One document caught my attention, a transfer order dated 1967, moving this engine from Edwards Air Force Base to Project Blue Light classified location. Below that, someone had scrawled, "Return to sender," in red ink, but the address was blacked out with heavy marker. My hands were shaking as I read through page after page of bureaucratic language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. That night, I couldn't sleep. Margaret's old recliner had become my refuge for insomnia, and Duke lay across my feet while I stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what I'd stumbled into. In all my years of auction hunting, I'd never bought anything that came with classified military documentation. The rational part of my brain said to contact the authorities and let them sort it out. But something deeper held me back. Maybe it was the way that supervisor had acted, or the hasty way they'd loaded my purchase, but I had the distinct feeling that someone had wanted this engine to disappear, and I'd accidentally interfered with that plan. Over the next few days, I did some quiet research. The J-57 engine had powered some of the most important aircraft of the Cold War era: F-100 Super Sabres, B-52 Stratofortresses, F-101 Voodoos. This particular serial number, according to what I could find online, had been installed in an F-101B Interceptor that had crashed during a training exercise in Nevada in 1967. The pilot, Captain Michael Restrepo, had ejected safely, but the aircraft had been listed as a total loss. According to official records, all major components had been recovered and returned to depot for analysis or disposal. But here was the engine sitting in my garage, apparently never having been properly processed through military salvage channels. Duke seemed to understand the gravity of the situation better than I did initially. He'd position himself between me and the engine whenever strangers came around the garage, and he'd grown increasingly protective of the manila envelope I kept locked in Margaret's old hope chest. It was as if he knew we were guardians of something important, something that powerful people might want to keep buried. The breakthrough came when I decided to contact Captain Restrepo directly. Military records showed he'd survived the crash and retired as a colonel in 1989, settling in Phoenix with his family. When I called his number, expecting to leave a voicemail, a weak but alert voice answered on the third ring. Colonel Restrepo speaking. I explained who I was and what I'd found, reading him the serial number from his old engine. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the line had gone dead. "Mr. Kowalski," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd hear that number again. That crash, it wasn't just a training accident. We were testing experimental radar equipment, stuff that was supposed to stay classified for decades. When I ejected, I saw men in civilian clothes already moving toward the wreckage before the rescue helicopters even arrived. I filed reports, asked questions, but I was told to forget what I'd seen for the good of national security." He paused, and I could hear labored breathing. "I've been fighting lung cancer for 2 years, Mr. Kowalski. The doctors say I've got maybe 6 months. Finding that engine, it's like getting a piece of my life back." Colonel Restrepo asked if he could come see the engine in person, and something in his voice made it impossible to say no. 3 weeks later, a rental car pulled into my driveway, and a thin man in his 70s slowly extracted himself from the driver's seat. He moved like someone carrying invisible weight, but his eyes were sharp and determined. Duke approached him cautiously, then seemed to reach some internal decision and sat quietly at the colonel's feet while he examined his old engine. "She's beautiful," he whispered, running his hands over the metal casing like a man greeting an old friend. 40,000 pounds of thrust, reliable as sunrise, never let me down until that day in Nevada." He pulled out a photograph from his wallet, himself as a young pilot standing next to an F-101B, grinning at the camera with the confidence of someone who believed he was invincible. "Mr. Kowalski, this engine was part of a program that helped keep this country safe during some very dark times. It deserves better than being buried in some government warehouse or sold for scrap." Over the next few hours, Colonel Restrepo told me the real story of his crash. The experimental radar system had detected something unusual, possibly Soviet surveillance equipment, operating near a classified facility. His mission was to investigate, but the equipment had malfunctioned catastrophically, forcing him to eject over some of the most remote terrain in Nevada. The official investigation had blamed pilot error and classified all the technical details, effectively ending any inquiry into what had really happened. "They told me the wreckage was too damaged to learn anything useful," he said, his voice growing stronger as he talked. "But seeing this engine, seeing how pristine it is, someone recovered everything and then made it disappear. The question is why." Duke had been listening to our conversation with the intensity he usually reserved for tracking rabbits, his head turning back and forth between us like he was following every word. Colonel Restrepo had brought his own manila envelope filled with copies of incident reports, medical records, and correspondence with Air Force investigators that painted a picture of institutional cover-up and deliberate obfuscation. When we spread all the documents out on my workbench, a pattern emerged that made my blood run cold. The engine serial number appeared on multiple inventory lists, each time with a different disposition code. Sometimes it was listed as destroyed in crash, other times as returned to depot, and once as transferred to contractor for analysis. "Someone's been playing shell games with military property for decades," I said, the pieces finally clicking together in my mind. "This engine has been officially disposed of multiple times, but somehow it keeps showing up in government surplus auctions under different lot numbers and descriptions. Colonel Restrepo nodded grimly, pulling out a legal pad covered with notes he'd been making during his own investigation. I've tracked at least 12 other components from crashed or retired aircraft that have followed similar paths, he said. Engines, avionics, even complete airframes that were supposed to have been scrapped or destroyed. Someone's been systematically looting military salvage operations and selling the equipment to collectors or foreign buyers. He showed me photographs of aircraft engines displayed in private museums, each bearing serial numbers that corresponded to aircraft officially listed as completely destroyed. The implications were staggering. If Colonel Restrepo was right, we weren't just looking at simple government inefficiency. This was organized theft of military equipment on a massive scale, involving people with access to classified information and the ability to manipulate official records. Duke sensed the tension in the room and moved closer to my chair, his warm presence a reminder that whatever we decided to do, we wouldn't be doing it alone. That night, after Colonel Restrepo had returned to his motel, I sat in Margaret's chair and stared at the evidence spread across my coffee table. 45 years of fixing other people's problems had taught me that the simplest solutions were usually the right ones, but this situation was anything but simple. We had proof of what appeared to be systematic fraud involving military property, but the people responsible clearly had enough influence to make problems disappear, including, potentially, problems like me and Duke. Colonel Restrepo's phone call came at 6 in the morning. "Mr. Kowalski, I need you to listen carefully. Someone broke into my motel room last night while I was at dinner. They didn't take anything, but they went through all my papers, photographed everything. We need to move fast before this gets buried again." His voice had the crisp authority of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions under pressure. We agreed to meet at the garage at noon, but when I arrived, I found Colonel Restrepo's rental car parked behind the building with 2 other vehicles I didn't recognize. Duke's hackles were up before I even turned off the engine, and he stayed close to my side as we approached the garage. Through the windows, I could see several men in suits examining the engine, while Colonel Restrepo sat in a folding chair, looking older and more fragile than he had the day before. "Mr. Kowalski," one of the suits said as I entered, flashing identification too quickly for me to read. "I'm Agent Morrison with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. We need to ask you some questions about how you acquired this engine." His tone was polite, but carried the unmistakable weight of federal authority. Duke positioned himself between me and the agents, not threatening but clearly alert to potential danger. What followed was 3 hours of the most intense questioning I'd ever experienced. Agent Morrison and his partner wanted to know everything: where I'd bought the engine, who I'd talked to about it, what research I'd done, what documents I'd seen. They were particularly interested in my communications with Colonel Restrepo and seemed surprised by the depth of our investigation. Throughout the interrogation, Duke never left my side, and I drew strength from his steady presence. "Gentlemen," I finally said when they paused for breath, "I bought some surplus equipment at a legal government auction. Everything I've done since then has been an attempt to understand what I'd purchased and ensure it was handled properly. If there's been wrongdoing here, it didn't start with me, and it won't end with me keeping quiet." Colonel Restrepo gave me a small nod of approval, and I knew we were thinking the same thing. Agent Morrison exchanged glances with his partner before speaking again. "Mr. Kowalski, you and Colonel Restrepo have uncovered what appears to be a long-running fraud scheme involving multiple military installations and civilian contractors. The engine in your garage was supposed to have been destroyed in 1967, along with all the classified equipment it powered. Instead, it's been circulated through a network of people who've been profiting from selling stolen military property. The investigation that followed consumed the next 6 months of my life. Duke and I made multiple trips to various military installations, congressional offices, and federal courthouses, always carrying copies of our evidence in case something happened to the originals. Colonel Restrepo's cancer progressed rapidly, but he refused to let his illness slow down his pursuit of the truth. "This is my last mission," he told me during one of his weaker days. "I want to complete it properly." The scope of the fraud was breathtaking. When federal investigators finally unraveled the full network, they found evidence of theft involving hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military equipment spanning 4 decades. The scheme involved depot supervisors, civilian contractors, auction house employees, and even some active duty personnel who had been deliberately misclassifying salvageable equipment as destroyed in order to divert it to illegal sales channels. My garage became an unofficial evidence warehouse as investigators brought in more recovered items: aircraft engines, avionics systems, even complete helicopters that had been reported as destroyed but had actually been sold to private collectors. Duke adapted to the constant stream of strangers with characteristic patience, though he never let his guard down completely. I think he understood that we were protecting something important, something bigger than just ourselves. The prosecutions began 8 months after that first phone call to Colonel Restrepo. 23 people were eventually charged with various federal crimes, including the supervisor who had sold me the engine at that county auction. During his trial, it came out that he had been deliberately steering valuable military hardware to specific auctions where Confederates could purchase it at artificially low prices, then resell it to collectors or foreign buyers at enormous profits. Colonel Restrepo lived long enough to see the first convictions, passing away peacefully in his sleep 2 days after testifying via video link from his hospital bed. His final words to the court were a request that recovered military equipment be displayed in museums where veterans and their families could honor the service of those who had operated it. It was a fitting end for a man who had spent his final months fighting not for personal gain, but for the principle that public property should serve the public good. The legal resolution brought some closure, but the emotional impact of the experience continued to resonate long after the trials ended. I had always seen myself as a simple mechanic who minded his own business and took care of his family. But the investigation had forced me to recognize that sometimes minding your own business isn't enough. Sometimes circumstances demand that ordinary people step forward and do extraordinary things, not because they're heroes, but because they're the only ones in position to act. Duke seemed to understand that our mission was complete. The constant vigilance that had marked his behavior during the investigation gradually relaxed, and he returned to his normal routine of supervising my work and greeting customers with measured friendliness. But I noticed that he paid closer attention to strangers than he had before, and he never completely abandoned the protective positioning that had become second nature during our months as amateur investigators. The financial rewards were modest, but meaningful. The government recovery program provided compensation for citizens who helped locate stolen federal property, and my share was enough to modernize the garage and establish a small scholarship fund in Margaret's memory for local students pursuing technical education. More importantly, several museums requested permission to display Colonel Restrepo's engine as part of exhibits honoring Cold War aviation, ensuring that his final mission would continue to serve its purpose long after both of us were gone. On quiet evenings now, when Duke and I sit on the front porch watching traffic pass on the state highway, I sometimes reflect on how a simple auction purchase changed the trajectory of our lives. The experience taught me that integrity isn't just about how you conduct your own affairs. Sometimes it requires you to speak up when you witness wrongdoing, even when it would be easier and safer to remain silent. It also reinforced something Margaret had always believed, that ordinary people, when they act with courage and persistence, can accomplish things that seem impossible at the outset. Duke's loyalty throughout the investigation reminded me that the most valuable relationships are often the ones that don't require words. His presence during difficult conversations, his alertness to potential threats, and his unwavering companionship during long days of testimony and documentation provided a stability that kept me grounded when the pressure mounted. In many ways, he was the perfect partner for a mission that required both courage and patience, qualities that seem to come naturally to dogs, but require conscious effort from their human companions. The garage operates much as it always has, with the same commitment to honest work and fair prices that Margaret and I established decades ago. But there's a new awareness now of how individual actions can intersect with larger systems, and how ordinary citizens bear responsibility for holding those systems accountable. The small placard by the cash register, displaying a photograph of Colonel Restrepo's F-101B, serves as a daily reminder that the equipment we recovered wasn't just military hardware. It was a piece of history that belonged to everyone, and protecting it was worth the risks we took. Looking back, I realized that the most important discovery wasn't the engine itself, but the recognition that age and ordinariness don't disqualify someone from making a difference. Duke and I weren't equipped with special training or resources, just the willingness to ask questions when something didn't seem right, and the persistence to keep asking until we found answers. Sometimes that's all it takes to uncover truth that powerful people prefer to keep buried. The experience has left me with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of the world we inhabit and the countless ways that individual integrity contributes to the common good. Every day, ordinary people make choices about whether to speak up or remain silent, whether to investigate inconsistencies or accept them at face value, whether to act on their convictions or defer to authority. The cumulative impact of those choices shapes the society we all share, and each of us bears some responsibility for ensuring that shape reflects our highest values rather than our most convenient compromises. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between personal safety and doing what you knew was right? Maybe you've discovered something that didn't seem quite right, but questioning it would have meant challenging people with more authority or resources than you had. I'd love to hear about your experiences, because I've learned that these moments of moral choice happen more often than we realize, and sharing our stories helps all of us recognize the courage we're capable of when circumstances demand it. Tell me about a time when you had to decide whether to speak up or stay quiet. What did you choose, and how did it turn out?